Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we explore the Middle Ages, that fascinating thousand-year stretch where people believed diseases were demons, cats were spies, and the cure for anything involved either prayer or setting something on fire. Before we begin, if you enjoy these soothing historical journeys, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your location. It's always interesting to see our global community. Now get comfortable, perhaps adjust your lighting, maybe turn on some gentle background sound, and let's drift into tonight's exploration together. It all began in July 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophia stepped out into the streets of Strasbourg and started dancing. No music, no audience, no apparent reason, just a one-woman performance in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire. At first, people assumed she'd lost a bet or her mind. But when she kept dancing for days, her neighbors realized something far worse was happening. Exercise. Soon, dozens joined her, moving like they were possessed, twitching, stomping, collapsing, and occasionally perishing mid-step. Contemporary reports say as many as 400 people were dancing uncontrollably. Because medieval Europe couldn't just have a nice summer, it had to host the first recorded silent disco of doom. Naturally, the authorities decided to help by doing something profoundly unwise. Instead of quarantining the dancers or asking why everyone was convulsing, they built a stage and hired musicians. Yes, they turned mass hysteria into a civic festival. Theories vary. Some blame ergot poisoning caused by a hallucinogenic fungus on rye bread. In simpler terms, the entire town accidentally consumed something that altered their minds. Others suggest it was mass psychogenic illness, meaning everyone went temporarily insane together. Medieval Europe's favorite group activity. Doctors blamed hot blood. Their solution? Make the dancers keep dancing to sweat it out. Because nothing cures exhaustion like more exhaustion. Meanwhile, priests claimed the townfolk had offended Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancing, and sent them on a reluctant pilgrimage to his shrine. Imagine crawling for miles with blisters, delirium, and 16th century shoes. Eventually, the dancers collapsed, the music stopped, and Strasbourg went back to normal, which in the 1500s still meant plague, famine, and questionable dental care. But the legend stuck. Historians now call it mass hysteria, though it's hard to say what's stranger, people dancing themselves to exhaustion, or their government doubling down with live entertainment. In 897 AD, the Catholic Church decided to take drama to a level usually reserved for theatrical performances. It began when Pope Stephen VI decided that simply disliking his predecessor wasn't enough. He had to prosecute his corpse. Yes, you heard that right. The late Pope Formosus had been deceased for about 9 months when Stephen ordered him exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and dragged into court. The event became known as the Cadaver Synod.
The trial opened with the deceased Formosus sitting upright on a throne, his skeletal remains wobbling under the weight of his vestments. A deacon was appointed to speak for the defendant, which feels unnecessary since the defendant's tongue had decayed months prior. Witnesses gasped as Stephen screamed accusations at the corpse: perjury, ambition, and the mortal sin of existing before Stephen did. The outcome was predetermined. Formosus was found guilty on all charges. His papal garments were removed, his blessing fingers cut off, and his corpse was tossed unceremoniously into the Tiber River. For a brief moment, Stephen must have felt triumphant, until everyone else realized their pope had just publicly confronted a corpse. Riots broke out. Eventually, Stephen himself was imprisoned and eliminated in his cell. The whole episode revealed what medieval politics were really about: personal grudges, holy theatrics, and absolutely no supervision. Medieval rumor had it that when powerful churchmen perished, their bodies sometimes exploded. Most dismissed it as tavern talk. Unfortunately for William the Conqueror's relatives, and later Henry of Blois, history suggests there may have been a literal burst behind the legend. In the 12th century, embalming wasn't an exact science. You drained some blood, sprinkled herbs, waved a Bible at the corpse, and hoped for the best.
Then you sealed the body in a lead coffin under a hot stone cathedral where air circulation was non-existent. Chroniclers recorded that one bishop was laid to rest in the heat of midsummer, and within days, his tomb began making sounds. Monks claimed it was his soul escaping purgatory. More likely, it was methane escaping everywhere else. When the lid finally cracked, the odor was so severe that several witnesses fell to their knees, not from faith, but from nausea. The cathedral quietly replaced the tiles, and no one discussed it again. Forensic historians now think the legend came from real accidents during medieval burials. Corpses sealed too tightly would swell with gas until the coffin split open. The church naturally spun this into theology, a convenient warning against pride and gluttony. Modern scientists call it decomposition. Medieval chroniclers called it divine judgment. Either way, the result was the same, an unforgettable reminder that even the holiest among us are vulnerable to natural processes. In an age where most people couldn't read, but everyone could panic, few rumors spread faster than the idea that communion wafers were bleeding. According to the faithful, these weren't just symbolic bread. They were literal representations of sacred flesh, and occasionally they bled to prove it. The first reports appeared across Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. A priest would handle a wafer, and it would start showing red. Instead of asking obvious questions, the clergy concluded it was miraculous. One famous case occurred in Bolsena, Italy around 1263, when a priest doubting transubstantiation saw his wafer produce red liquid onto the altar cloth during Mass. His disbelief turned into instant terror. The cloth was rushed to Pope Urban IV, who promptly declared it miraculous. He even built a cathedral to commemorate the occasion. Of course, centuries later, science offered explanation. Microbiologists discovered a cheerful red bacterium called Serratia marcescens. It thrives on moist bread and produces red pigment. Translation: the sacred bleeding was an enthusiastic case of bacterial growth. But in the Middle Ages, no one wanted to hear that. Bleeding wafers drew crowds. Pilgrims came to witness them, offered coins, and left with blessed fragments. Every oozing wafer was another sign that faith worked, even if biology was quietly disagreeing. In the Grand Museum of Medieval Nightmares, few exhibits are as disturbing as the Rat King, a tangled mass of rats whose tails have somehow fused together, forcing them to move as one horrible, squeaking organism. The people of Lübeck, a proud German trading city, swore they'd seen them during outbreaks of plague. Scholars dismissed it as tavern gossip. After all, medieval Europe already had enough horrors without inventing new ones. But in 1828, long after the Middle Ages, a farmer discovered a real rat king. 32 rodents fused by tails, hardened with dirt, blood, and bodily fluids. They were preserved and displayed in museums, where they remain to this day. Modern science says rat kings happen when young rats are trapped in a nest coated with sticky substances, and their tails knot together. As they grow, the tangled tail's bones fuse, and nature quietly abandons quality control. To medieval minds, though, this was no accident. It was an omen, a living symbol of plague and sin. If you saw a rat king, it meant divine anger was near. The legend wasn't exaggerated. The peasants really did see a writhing mass of rats knotted by fate, and the next day half the town would be suffering.
Sometimes folklore doesn't lie. It just leaves out the smell. If you ever find yourself in Wales and see a sign for Holywell, you might assume it's just another village with an enthusiastic church. But this one earned its name by sprouting from a decapitated saint. The story goes back to the 7th century when a nobleman named Caradog developed an interest in a pious young woman called Winifred. She wasn't interested and fled toward a chapel where her uncle, Saint Buno, was praying. Caradog, demonstrating medieval courtship at its finest, responded by removing her head. Immediately, a spring burst from the ground where it fell, turning tragedy into tourism. Buno, apparently unfazed, picked up her head, reattached it,
and performed miraculous restoration. Winifred survived long enough to become a nun, a saint, and the patron of people who've had an objectively worse day than you. Over the centuries, the spring at Holywell became one of Britain's most visited pilgrimage sites. Kings, commoners, and the occasional sinner immersed themselves in its icy waters, hoping for healing. Then came the Reformation, when every miracle was suddenly suspiciously Catholic. Reformers tried to close the shrine and drain the well, only for the spring to keep flowing defiantly.
Today, the well still flows, a bubbling relic of belief and survival. Scientists tested it and found the water rich in minerals that could technically promote healing, which means everyone's been arguing for 1,300 years about whether it's divine miracle or excellent geology. Either way, Saint Winifred got the final word. Her legend turned a gruesome incident into a national spa, and her well continues to draw believers and skeptics alike. If you ever feel your workplace drama is severe, remember the Knights Templar, the only organization in history that went from heroes of the Crusades to condemned in under a century. The Templars began as holy warriors sworn to protect pilgrims. Over time, they evolved into the medieval version of an international bank, loaning kings money and building fortresses. By the early 1300s, they had wealth, influence, and matching outfits, three things guaranteed to make any monarch insecure. Enter King Philip IV of France, a man so financially strained he once pawned his own crown. He owed the Templars a small fortune and decided that repaying them was unnecessary. Arresting them, however, was apparently very necessary. So in 1307, Philip ordered every Templar in France arrested on the same day, a move that can only be described as the original Friday the 13th disaster. The charges: heresy, idol worship, and kissing each other's feet. The imprisoned knights confessed to everything, mainly because medieval interrogation techniques involved hot implements and zero pain management. Their leader, Jacques de Molay, was eventually burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. According to witnesses, as the flames rose, de Molay summoned both the king and pope to meet him before God within the year. Both men actually perished within that time frame. Philip's passing was particularly embarrassing, thrown from his horse during a hunt. Whether you call it divine retribution or coincidence, the story endured. The Templars went up in flames, but their reputation refused to extinguish. The legacy of their curse lingered for generations, some even linking it to later historical events. The moral: never cross someone with a sword, a grievance, and exceptional timing for dramatic final words. The Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, eliminating so many people that faith itself faced scrutiny. Amid the chaos appeared one of history's most unsettling fashion icons, the Plague Doctor. Long leather coat, wide-brimmed hat, and a beaked mask that made him look like a demonic bird. The outfit was meant to protect doctors from miasma, the bad air everyone blamed for disease. The beak was stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked cloth to purify the air. The long coat was waxed to resist infection, gloves sealed tight, and the staff used to examine patients from a safe distance. Ironically, the plague doctors were often not trained physicians. Many were volunteers or barber surgeons looking for extra income. Cities hired them when everyone else either perished or fled. And while the appearance became legendary, the results were mixed. The waxed leather helped slightly, the mask not at all. Plague doctors still contracted disease with impressive efficiency, proving that fashion can't save you from biology. But the image endured, a terrifying symbol of survival, science, and utter confusion. Medieval Europe really did put its faith in someone who looked like a crow conducting an investigation. And frankly, given the state of public health back then, it was progress. Long before ghost hunting television shows, the Welsh countryside had its own brand of supernatural tourism, the corpse candles.
People in medieval Wales swore they saw glowing orbs floating above roads and graveyards, drifting silently through the night like lanterns carried by invisible hands. They weren't just atmospheric, they were prophetic. According to local tradition, if you saw a corpse candle, it meant someone nearby was about to perish. The lights were said to vary in size, small ones for infants, large ones for adults. Witnesses described them weaving along paths that later became funeral routes, hovering over streams before disappearing. To villagers, that was solid evidence of divine involvement. To modern scientists, it was flammable gas plus weather. In the centuries before chemistry existed, people had no idea that decomposing organic matter releases phosphine and methane, which can spontaneously ignite in damp conditions. Today, we call it swamp gas. Back then, it was mortality whispering greetings. The church had opinions. Some priests claimed the lights were angels guiding souls. Others insisted they were demons luring travelers. The stories persisted for centuries. Modern researchers eventually proved the peasants were partially correct. The lights did exist, just not because heaven had a lantern budget. The real culprit was rotting vegetation doing its best impression of divine warning. The medieval corpse lights were real, just slightly less supernatural than advertised. If you've ever seen medieval murals filled with skeletons holding hands and dancing around priests and kings, you've met the dance macabre, or dance of death. It was the Middle Ages version of a motivational reminder, except instead of encouraging phrases, it said, "You're next." The legend claimed that at midnight the deceased rose from their graves to dance in the churchyard. Skeletons, nobles, peasants, all joining arms in a grotesque celebration of equality. The message was clear. No matter your title or status, mortality doesn't discriminate. The story began circulating after the Black Death eliminated a third of the continent. People needed a way to explain why their neighbors kept perishing. So they did what humans always do: turn trauma into art. Artists across France and Germany painted skeletal processions on chapel walls, some labeling the corpses as kings or popes to emphasize the point. To medieval peasants, these murals weren't morbid. They were comforting. Mortality was everywhere, so it might as well have choreography. Villagers swore they heard faint music from cemeteries at night or saw bones shifting in moonlight. Modern historians believe the dancing remains sightings were optical illusions. Moonlight, fog, and decomposing bodies doing what they do. But honestly, if you'd lived through 3 plagues, you might have seen things too. The dance macabre spread across Europe, from frescoes to stage plays. It became the medieval world's most successful franchise, reminding everyone that life was short and humor essential. So yes, the stories of dancing skeletons were technically true, not because bones moved, but because people did. Every dance and prayer in medieval Europe was a defiant gesture against the inevitable. The skeletons didn't need to rise. They were already inside everyone, patiently waiting. In the medieval imagination, the underworld wasn't some distant metaphysical realm. It was just a difficult neighborhood with volcanic activity. Travelers' accounts spoke of real places where the earth hissed, the air burned, and locals swore you could hear souls suffering. One such spot gained particular notoriety: a lake in Iceland said to boil with otherworldly cries. The legend began with early Christian missionaries who landed on the volcanic island, looked around at the steaming craters, and reasonably concluded they'd overshot paradise. The earth gurgled, the ground smoked, and pools bubbled like cauldrons. Word spread fast. Chroniclers described waters that burn and stones that hiss. Pilgrims avoided the area. The name Faravellir entered folklore as a literal gateway below. Medieval mapmakers even labeled parts of it as Northern Inferno. Later, visitors claimed to hear screams echoing through the steam. Locals said it was just gas escaping from deep fissures. Either way, Iceland got branded as real estate directly above punishment. When science finally caught up, geologists explained the phenomenon. Magma heated groundwater, turning lakes into bubbling basins. Perfectly natural. But that didn't make it less terrifying to anyone standing nearby with fragile beliefs. What's impressive is how long the legend endured. Even into the 17th century, European travelers kept returning home with tales of boiling pits that roared like demons. So yes, the boiling lake existed, though the screams of the condemned were really sulfur vents doing their best impression of human regret.
When faced with a volcano, they didn't panic. They theologized. And somehow, that feels very human. For centuries, the people of Venice whispered that their city was home to vampires, not the elegant kind. These were plague-bitten corpses who allegedly rose from shallow graves to threaten the living. The legend began during the Black Death, when burial pits overflowed and people started noticing something horrifying. Some bodies looked disturbed. Shrouds were torn, faces bloated, and dark fluids leaked from mouths. Lacking access to science, the gravediggers concluded the corpses were feeding. Naturally, the only solution was to shove a brick in their mouths. For centuries, this sounded like wild medieval rumor. But in 2006, archaeologists excavating a plague pit on the Venetian island of Lazzaretto Nuovo found a real skeleton with a brick jammed between its teeth. Forensic analysis revealed the vampire was a woman about 60 years old. The brick, experts explained, was an early attempt at preventing corpses from spreading disease. People thought plague was caused by deceased breath. Blocking the mouth stopped the threat, or so they hoped. Medieval public health at its finest. No soap, just masonry. It was a perfect storm of ignorance and imagination. The corpse's decomposing face had produced gases which made the shroud tear. Gravediggers interpreted this as evidence of feeding. So yes, the vampire of Venice was real, at least in bone and brick. Not a creature of the night, just a casualty of misunderstanding. In the year 1284, the citizens of Bologna looked up to the sky and saw something deeply unholy. It was meat, actual chunks of raw flesh falling from the heavens like some nightmarish medieval delivery service. Eyewitnesses swore it rained for several minutes. The event was recorded by monks who described a shower of bloody meat that covered the countryside. People collected the chunks and, being medieval Europeans, immediately started debating whether to consume them. Scholars debated if it was angelic sustenance or divine warning. Some claimed it was flesh from fallen sinners. Others suggested optimistically that it might be pork. Modern science has, sadly, ruined the excitement again. Historians now suspect the phenomenon was caused by flocks of birds, most likely vultures, regurgitating mid-flight. When startled or overfed, scavenger birds eject stomach contents to lighten their load. So in essence, Bologna experienced the first recorded case of aerial food delivery. But to medieval minds, there was no logical explanation, just divine symbolism and mild hysteria. Priests warned it was an omen. The bishop reportedly declared a day of fasting, which feels counterproductive when meat is literally falling from the sky. Similar incidents were reported elsewhere: frogs in France, fish in Scotland. The Middle Ages were basically one long episode of weather gone wrong. So yes, it really did rain meat in Bologna. Not divine wrath, just the stomach of a stressed bird squadron. If nothing else, it proves that in medieval Europe, every miracle had an odor. In the medieval world, people didn't trust competence. If something worked too well, it had to be unnatural. Enter the legend of the Devil's Bridge, or rather dozens of them. From France to Wales to Switzerland, nearly every village with a well-built bridge insisted it had been designed by infernal forces. Apparently, masonry was above mortal capability. The story always went like this. Villagers needed a bridge over a gorge. After several failed attempts, they called upon darker powers. An agreement was made. Build the bridge overnight in exchange for the soul of the first creature to cross it. The villagers, being experts in loopholes, usually sent a goat or dog across first. This enraged the builder, who'd spent the night showing off Gothic architecture, only to end up with livestock for payment. The most famous example stands in Lugano, Switzerland, a perfect stone arch so impossibly precise that locals still call it Ponte del Diavolo. In Wales, there's another over a roaring waterfall. According to legend, the builder came to collect his due,
only to be tricked by an old woman's dog. Modern archaeologists point out that medieval stonemasons were simply skilled at their jobs. The bridges used ingenious keystones and pressure distribution, proof of advanced engineering, not infernal subcontracting. But in a world where people thought lightning was divine punctuation, supernatural construction was perfectly acceptable. Today, there are over 50 Devil's Bridges across Europe, each one a monument to humanity's long relationship with paranoia and clever storytelling. So yes, the bridges were real. The infernal architect probably wasn't, unless he also worked part-time as a civil engineer. Either way, the moral is clear. If you ever build something too impressive, expect credit from unexpected sources.
If you were a monk in medieval Yorkshire, nights at Byland Abbey were not as peaceful as Gregorian chants suggest. After dark, witnesses claimed the abbey came alive with groans, whispers, and the distinct sound of chains scraping across stone. Thus began the tale of the ghost monk of Byland, one of the oldest recorded hauntings in England. In the 1400s, a scribe at Byland decided to document the abbey's many ghostly encounters. He didn't just note them down, he cataloged them like divine case files. 20 separate hauntings, each complete with names and dates. The most famous was the chained monk, a spirit said to rise nightly from a forgotten crypt beneath the cloisters, muttering prayers and dragging iron bonds. According to the account, one brave brother finally confronted the apparition. When asked why he couldn't rest, the ghost explained in flawless Latin that he had perished with unconfessed sins. The chain was his penance. After the community held a special mass for his soul, the monk vanished, leaving behind only his rattling chain and several traumatized witnesses. Historians appreciate this story because it's one of the first ghost tales written as fact rather than folklore. The monk wasn't treated as a cautionary symbol. He was handled like someone with unfinished business. It perfectly captures the medieval worldview. Ghosts weren't horror creatures. They were souls waiting for resolution. Excavations centuries later found a real crypt beneath Byland Abbey with human remains bound in corroded iron links. Whether it was a relic of penance or imprisonment, no one knows. But it gave the legend just enough evidence to crawl out of the realm of pure myth. And there you have it. 15 medieval legends that history proved disturbingly real. From dancing plagues that swept through streets to bishops who exploded in their tombs. From bleeding bread caused by bacteria to rat kings knotted by fate. These weren't just stories told around fires. They were events recorded, witnessed, and eventually explained by science. Though explanation never quite erased the wonder. The Middle Ages weren't just a time of ignorance and superstition. They were a period when humanity tried desperately to make sense of a world they couldn't fully understand. When they saw corpse lights glowing in Welsh marshes, they didn't know about methane. They just knew something inexplicable was happening. When they watched people dance themselves to exhaustion in Strasbourg, they had no concept of mass hysteria or ergot poisoning. They only saw suffering that needed explanation. What makes these legends remarkable isn't just that they were true. It's that medieval people, armed with nothing but faith and folklore, still managed to preserve these stories accurately enough for future generations to verify them. They may have misunderstood the causes, but they didn't exaggerate the effects. The plague doctor really did dress like a macabre bird. The Templars really were arrested on Friday the 13th. The vampire of Venice really did have a brick in her mouth. These legends remind us that truth is often stranger than fiction, and that history is full of mysteries that only seem obvious in hindsight. Every impossible tale has a kernel of reality waiting to be discovered, whether it's bacterial growth masquerading as miracle or volcanic lakes mistaken for gateways below. So the next time you hear a legend that sounds too bizarre to be true, remember the Middle Ages. Remember that sometimes, the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened. And perhaps that's the real magic. Not that these legends were true, but that people believed them so completely, they ensured they'd never be forgotten. Sleep well, knowing that history's strangest tales are often its most honest ones. The medieval world may have been strange,
superstitious, and occasionally terrifying. But it was undeniably, fascinatingly, and verifiably real. Sweet dreams, and may your own legends be equally memorable, if slightly less explosive.